See Jesus stripped of majesty. He hangs disfigured on a tree. A man of grief by man betrayed, like one from whom we turn away. Led like a lamb without a sign, in mockery with violence climbed, a sacrificial offering, atoning for his people's sin. Oh, what amazing love! I bow before the cross, my pride reduced to dust. What amazing love! It overwhelms my soul, my broken life made whole.
See Jesus cold within the grave, cut off from life, our lives to save. We thought that God had punished him, but he was pierced for Adam's sin. Though we like sheep have often strayed, our waywardness on Christ was made. To heal our wounds he drew our pain, to bring us peace he bore our shame.
Oh, what amazing love! I bow before the cross, my pride reduced to dust. What amazing love! It overwhelms my soul, my broken life made whole. See Jesus once again draw breath and rise to claim the spoils of death. He sees the light of life again and hears his ransomed people sing. What amazing love! Forever I will praise the glories of your grace. What amazing love! I offer up my life, a grateful sacrifice. Oh, what amazing love! Forever I will praise the glories of your grace. What amazing love! I offer up my life, a grateful sacrifice for your amazing love. Your amazing love.
Hey everybody, welcome to the stream today. We have our brother Anthony Rogers with us. I am filling in for our sister Hatun, and just want to welcome our brother Anthony. Hey Anthony, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
We're really happy to get on this topic. So maybe some of you people have heard objections from skeptics, maybe atheists, agnostics, Muslims, Jews, whoever they are. You might have heard them say things like, how can you guys trust the Gospels? How do you know John wrote John? Or who is Mark? Mark who? Luke? How do you guys know who wrote these Gospels? So that's going to be our topic today with Brother Anthony. We're going to be covering the authorship of the Gospels, hopefully to inspire some confidence in our brothers and sisters in the Lord, and to also show the skeptics that we do have answers to these questions by God's grace. So thanks, Anthony, for joining us again, and we're really excited to get into the topic with you.
Yeah, so I should say when Hatun first asked me to address this, she specifically mentioned Matthew's gospel. And so I have a number of things prepared on Matthew's gospel. Now, it is in many ways relevant to the other gospels, and I'm happy to address any questions that people have on that. But I kind of thought, since she originally asked me to do this one, and this one by itself really is involves a lot of different issues, so would probably naturally cover several episodes. So kind of thought that what I would do is begin to address the evidence for Matthean authorship for the first gospel, and then continue on from there in subsequent episodes, if that works
Yeah,
with you.
that's great. I'm just just getting kind of some of this information now, so I do apologize for any miscommunications or misunderstandings. But yeah, we can definitely do a series on this, and we'll start with Matthew, which is very fitting since it is the first gospel. So that's great. If you want to share your screen at all, I can definitely pull it up, or if however you want to get started, brother, we can begin however you'd like.
Okay, so I will share my screen, and you can tell me if it's working.
All right. Yep, we can see it up there.
All right. So, who authored the gospel according to Matthew? Now, it's obvious that those who don't believe that Matthew wrote the first gospel, or that any of the names ascribed to any of the gospels, uh, those who don't believe in the traditional ascriptions of authorship have a definite agenda. And that agenda, I think, is obvious to begin with, but it'll become more apparent as we go through this. But uh, behind the reason for wanting to question it, of course, is because they don't want these gospels to have any appearance of reliability, right? So the closer you get to the time of the events that are purported to have happened, that the writings are saying these things happened, the closer those writings are to the time of the event, the harder it is for people to just dismiss them, right? And similarly, when you have an author who is himself close to the events, or is himself or was himself part of the events, that's not comfortable for those who are opposed to the gospel witness either. And so there is quite clearly an agenda. You find that agenda in liberal scholarship. You find it, of course, in non-Christian religions, and obviously you find it when it comes to Muslims. Muslims realize that if the Gospels were written by the apostles, then that creates a huge problem for them, right? They have to create some kind of a disjunct between what the Quran is referring to as the Gospel and what Christians refer to as the Gospel. And so I think the agenda is obvious. But when we look at the evidence, we're going to see there's obviously something going on behind the denial of, again, traditional ascription to authorship. So basically, there's three lines of evidence that Matthew wrote the first gospel. And I'm only going to look at the first one today, which is the fact of the superscriptions. The other two areas of consideration are the external evidence, which refers to things like patristic testimony. And then a third area of evidence is the internal evidence. What sorts of things does the gospel say that would point us in the direction that it was written by the person that we say it was written by? All right. Now, before getting into the issue of the superscriptions, here's a quotation from D.A. Carson, Douglas Moo, and John Morris. These are three well-known, highly regarded New Testament scholars. And they point out, they say it's frequently asserted that the gospel commonly designated as Matthew's, like the other three canonical gospels, is anonymous. So they're saying this is a frequent assertion. Now, note what they say carefully here, because if you don't note what they say carefully, as well as continue on to how they conclude, you might make a false conclusion. But they say that is formally correct. That is, it is formally correct that the Gospels do not indicate who their author was. By formally correct, they mean that within the body of these writings, that is, within the narratives, there is no identification of who the author is, right? When you read Matthew's gospel, you don't read in its first sentence or anywhere from then on that Matthew is the author of the gospel. So they say that is formally correct. If the standard of comparison is, say, Paul's epistle to the Romans, where the opening lines of the agreed text designate both the author and the initial readers. There's nothing comparable in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Okay, so what they're referring to here is the well-known and easily discernible fact that when you turn to the New Testament epistles, you routinely see that in the opening, in the incipit of those epistles, there's an indication of who the author is, as well as who the recipients are. That is, the one who wrote it and the one or ones to whom he is writing. Okay, and this is basically what you'd expect in something that is part of the epistolary genre, meaning epistles. When you write an epistle to someone, you indicate who you are and you address the people that you're writing to. That's not necessarily the case in other writings, okay, but it is the case in epistolary writings. So when you compare the Gospels to something like the epistles, there is this noticeable difference, okay? There's this formal anonymity with respect to the Gospels that you don't find in the epistles. But notice how they go on. Nevertheless, we have no evidence that these Gospels ever circulated without an appropriate designation, kata matheon, which is Greek for according to Matthew or the like. Now, this is what we're going to focus on, is this evidence regarding this statement, but I don't want to move on too quickly from this observation that the Gospels are formally anonymous, meaning, again, in the body of these writings, we don't find a explicit reference to who the author is, because there's actually something significant to be noticed here. Okay, this is a statement from Larry Hurtado. He, again, is a New Testament scholar, well-known and highly regarded. He says, noting that many Old Testament books and several New Testament books are anonymous, he means, again, formally anonymous. They don't say in the body of these writings who the author was. He says, noting that many Old Testament books and several New Testament books are anonymous, David Ahn judged this a striking literary feature that nevertheless has been almost completely neglected. So Hurtado here is quoting another scholar, making the point that this is a striking literary feature that has been almost completely neglected. Now, why would David Ahn refer to this as a striking literary feature? Well, one thing to say before going on with the quote from Hurtado, there's more to the quote. One thing to say is everybody has to recognize that it would be problematic in the extreme if a book came into the hands of somebody and it really was anonymous. That is, they didn't know where it came from, they didn't know who wrote it. And the idea that you've got this religious community that's going to accept this bit of writing as though it's authoritative, reliable, and in fact the word of God, that just stretches credulity beyond the breaking point. There's just no, if I open my door in the morning and there's a book laying there and there's no reference to who the author is, I'm not going to pick it up and start saying, I'm not going to stake my eternal life on it, right? And even if the initial individual doesn't have those issues, he's not going to gather a significant number of people around that bit of writing unless he can do something. And in fact, just look at the history of the world's religions. They all try to tie the writing that they have to some authoritative individual. In some way, they want to demonstrate that it came through a reliable channel. Anyways, the quote from Hurtado goes on. For in the literary environment of the authors of the Gospels, the overwhelmingly customary practice was for authors of literary works, such as historical or biographical narratives, to identify themselves and claim credit for their work. So he's, again, remember, he's talking about formal identification or formal anonymity, right? That is, the within the body of the writing, you would expect in works in the first century that were historical and biographical for the person to make some reference to themselves, right? It goes on and says this was often done as part of the formal prologues to their works. And then in a footnote, it says this practice was typically followed by Jewish authors of the Greco-Roman period too. For example, the prologue to Josephus' Jewish War. Okay, so in the prologue of his account of the Jewish war, Josephus, the Jewish historian writing under the auspices of Rome, made clear that he was the author of the work. So in first century context, historical and biographical narratives did indicate who the author was. He goes on, so to release substantial works such as the New Testament Gospels anonymously was very unusual, amounting to a significant departure from literary practices of that time. Okay, then in a footnote, he makes a slight qualification on that with respect to the Gospel of John, where the author does tip his hand to some degree as to who it was that authored it, namely the beloved disciple and so forth. But going on, Hurtado says, in looking for scholarly attention to the matter, the most recent discussion I could find was an informative article by Armin D. Baum. This study documents Greek and Roman literary conventions, showing how striking the anonymity of the New Testament Gospels is. But Baum notes that anonymity of what he calls historiographical texts is also characteristic of Old Testament writings of this type, and he contends was practiced more widely in the ancient Near East. Okay, so what Baum points out and what Hurtado is pointing out from Baum is that while it is striking that the Gospels don't formally identify their authors, and this is striking because it represents a departure from literary conventions of the first century, nevertheless, this is exactly what you find in the case of many Old Testament books. Now, anybody who's familiar with these issues with respect to the Old Testament know that it's not the case that we are unaware of who those authors are, at least who they're traditionally understood to have been written by. All those books are understood to have been written by a prophetic hand. So, for example, the books of Samuel written by Samuel and so forth. But they're still formally anonymous. And so what Baum is pointing out is that the Gospels, in a context where it was otherwise normally the case that you would indicate who the authors are, it's striking that they depart from this. But it's also striking then to note that this is exactly the sort of thing you see in the Old Testament. And so, in effect, this shows something of the understanding of the authors of the Gospels, that they were writing something along these sorts of lines. That is, they're writing as though these things are part and parcel of the history that is continuing from the Old Testament. All right. Hurtado goes on. So it appears that the authors of the New Testament Gospels may have been influenced by the pattern of authorial anonymity in the Old Testament narratives that they considered scriptures. Greek and Roman authors identified themselves, wishing credit for their works. Did the authors of the New Testament Gospels think it inappropriate to identify themselves as the authors of these texts, wishing instead to simply to foreground the contents and simply serve the message cause? That is, in other words, they're foregrounding the account more so than themselves. They're thrusting forward the person of Christ and what he did rather than themselves. And then Hurtado concludes, in any case, the evident individuality of the four Gospels reflects the work of four authors, but for whatever reason, They did not wish to foreground themselves, and that is noteworthy. Okay, now, having said that the Gospels are formally anonymous, that doesn't mean that they are absolutely or anonymous in reality. And here you have, let's see. Oh, wait, there's one other quote I wanted to read from Hurtado before I get into that. He says, the anonymity of the New Testament Gospels also contrasts with the more direct authorial claims of subsequent apocryphal Gospels. For example, the opening lines of the Gospel of Thomas identify the text as the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke as Judas Thomas wrote them. These later texts tend to claim some unique revelation or insight granted to this or that named individual and denied to all other disciples of Jesus. And so, again, you have this striking fact that on the one hand, the Gospels in the narrative don't indicate who the author is, which departs from first century literary conventions, but is consistent with what you find throughout the Old Testament in the case of historical writings. And it also is a significant departure or difference from what would come later. I shouldn't say departure, because it's what comes later that's really departing from this. The later apocryphal Gospels do go out of their way and try to ascribe these writings to some individual, okay, that would authoritative. All right, so there are two expectations I think that we can make when we look at this, and with respect to the issue of anonymity. If the first gospel, and really all the gospels, actually circulated anonymously, and here I don't mean formally anonymous, but absolutely, meaning there was no understanding of who wrote them, we would expect to find different guesses or suggestions for who wrote it among both Christians and opponents of Christianity. Now, as an example of this, one of my favorite early Christian writings is known as the Epistle to Diognetus. Now, when you look at this bit of writing, there's no indication in the epistle who wrote it. And there's also no indication of who he was writing to. It's called the Epistle to Diognetus, but Diognetus is a title and not a name. And so there's a surprising array of proposals among different people for who wrote it, right? So you'll have some scholars saying that it was written by Clement, who's mentioned in Philippians 4:3, and otherwise known for writing an epistle to the church in Corinth, which we still have. There are others who say it was written by Apollos, who's mentioned in the book of Acts. There's still others who say that it was written by Justin Martyr, because the epistle was found with a collection of Justin Martyr's writings. Still others think that it was written by Quadratus, Pentanus, Polycarp. The list of proposed names goes on and on. That's the sort of thing that happens when a piece of writing is actually anonymous, when we don't know who wrote it. When the name does not get passed down with the literary artifact, then people aren't content just to let it be what it is. Everybody wants to have some idea of who wrote it. If for no other reason, then they need some kind of way of referring to it, right? And so it's not surprising that we have a long list of names associated with that particular piece of writing. So if it were the case that Matthew's gospel or any of the gospels actually went out into the world anonymously and people didn't know who wrote them, then one of the things we would expect to find are different names proposed for who authored this book, or in the case of all the gospels, who wrote all of them, right? Okay, another expectation is if the first gospel, and again, this is true for all the gospels, actually circulated anonymously, Matthew isn't the most likely name that early Christians would have assigned to it. Now, I should qualify this. John is, there's good evidence that John wrote the Gospel of John, but that's not a surprising choice. If people are fishing around for names to assign to this gospel to give it some sort of authority, John isn't so surprising. But it is surprising that Mark would be the name of this ascribed to the second gospel, right? Because Mark was not one of the apostles. Now, it is, according to the tradition, something that Mark wrote as a as the interpreter of Peter, right? So it is associated with Peter in that way. But if the early church was trying to give authority to this gospel so that people would accept it, then they would have just bypassed Mark, right? If they're just making up names and ascribing things to it to do that, then they would have bypassed Mark and just said it was written by Peter. But the early church doesn't do that. Similarly with Luke, Luke wasn't an apostle. He was a traveling companion of Paul's, but he wasn't one of the original 12. And so if somebody was just picking names out of a hat or picking names that they thought would give this book prestige and an air of authority, then Luke isn't the name you would have expected. And the same thing is true with respect to Matthew. Even though Matthew was an apostle, he wasn't a prominent apostle. And the gospel itself is quite evidently being written to Hebrews or to Jews. And Matthew for Jews would have already, cast an air or a stigma, would have been associated with this gospel, because Matthew was a tax collector, according to Matthew 10:3, and tax collectors were viewed by Jews as traitors, and all the more in the case of somebody who was a Levite. And so Matthew isn't the most likely name that would have been chosen. All right. Here's a quote from Dan Wallace to this effect. He says, although there's always the possibility of a vested interest on the part of patristic writers to seek apostolic authorship for the anonymous books of the New Testament, this does not explain why Matthew and no other apostle was ever suggested for the first gospel. Indeed, not only was Matthew by no means the most prominent of the apostles, but he also would not seem to be as qualified as some others to write to Jewish Christians in light of his former occupation. Would not Andrew or Philip or Bartholomew have been more likely candidates if an apostolic author were merely a figment of the early church? None of them had the stigma of having been in league with the Romans, and all figured more prominently in the gospel narratives. What is especially impressive is that Matthew, and now note this, is that Matthew and Matthew alone was suggested as the author of the first gospel. Okay, so notice that. I mentioned that there were two expectations that are quite sound and widely accepted among scholars. When you survey what was the case in ancient writings, if they were really sent out anonymously, numerous names were proposed for them, right? Because the door is open and people naturally want to give some name to them. So we would expect to find numerous names associated with this gospel. According to Dan Wallace, there are no other names associated with this gospel. Okay, that's striking. Okay, to anybody who's familiar with these sorts of matters when it comes to ancient writings that were sent forth into the world anonymously. But secondly, it also is contrary to what we would expect if the early church was making up names to give a gospel an air of authority. Matthew is not the name you would expect them to come up with. Okay, so in both these ways, we have strong evidence already for Matthean authorship. All right. Here's a quote from Martin Hengel. He's really the scholar that spearheaded the aspect of that I'm going to talk about or focus on. A lot of times when you pick up your Bible, you'll often notice that there are headers in your Bible, right? Like if you look at John 5, it might say something like Jesus heals a man, right? If you look at John 6, you might see it might say something like Jesus feeds a multitude, right? Something along those lines. I think most people recognize that those aren't part of what was written. Those are just their kind of like verse numbers or chapter divisions. Those aren't originally part of what was written by the authors. Those were added to facilitate ease of reference, right? That's, when we want to refer to something in the Gospels, I'll say John 7, 8, and that immediately alerts people where I'm referring to in the gospel. Okay, so those are conventions that help us to navigate to certain places in the text and help us at a glance to know what's going on in that particular pericope. Okay, so that sort of thing is not part of what was written. And because of that, a lot of people, when they open their Bibles, let's say to the first page of the New Testament, and they see the words according to Matthew, the assumption is that that's not part of what was in the manuscripts, just like the headers that we find elsewhere in the Gospels were added later to serve the conventional purpose of ease of reference or knowing what a section is about at a glance. They assume that's also the case with respect to those titles that you find at the beginning of the Gospels. But that's not true. And it's also not the case that those things, that it can be claimed that those things were added at a much later date. Okay, so here's what Hangel says along these lines. He says, the strange uniformity and early attestation of the titles of the Gospels excludes the possibility that for a long time they had been circulating anonymously in the communities, or even that, as in the case of some apocryphal texts from Nag Hammadi, they had received their titles as a secondary addition, or that these titles had even been changed. For if they had first, pardon the typo, for if they had first circulated anonymously and had been given their titles only at a secondary stage and independently of one another in the different communities, because a title was needed for announcing the reading in worship, this must necessarily resulted in a diversity of titles, as can be illustrated by many examples from antiquity. So notice he's making observations along the lines of some of what I've already said, right? When people refer to a piece of writing, they have to have some way of referring to it. And when the early church would read the memoirs of the apostles, they had to have some way of referring to them. And so the idea that these names only came to be associated with these books later is problematic in light of these sorts of things. Okay, he goes on, he says, on this assumption, the question why these particular titles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that is, of very different authors, were added also remains quite unexplained. There is no trace of such anonymity. Okay, now he's talking about the superscriptions above the Gospels. Okay, he's not talking about the body of writing, the narrative, but the superscriptions that appear on the manuscripts. He says, not only the complete uniformity of the titles from Alexandria in Egypt to Lyon in France, and from Antioch to Carthage before the end of the 2nd century, and their historical sequence, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, but also manifold references in the later 2nd century itself, whether to the Gospels as authoritative scripture, to its authors, show their great age, indeed, in my view, their original character. At least in the second half of the 2nd century after Justin, the references to author, title, and gospel text accumulate to such a degree that I need not go into the matter further. So what he's saying is, he doesn't need to go into all the evidence that can be found after the time of Justin, who was a 2nd century church father, because the evidence is so large and so well known that discussing it is unnecessary. But what he's doing is, he is talking about the stuff that we have pointing to the antiquity of this all the way back, that is, before Justin. He's saying that everything we have indicates that these superscriptions were part of the manuscripts from the very beginning. If they were not part of the manuscripts from the very beginning, then we would expect, we wouldn't expect, number one, for there to be these superscriptions attached to these, that they would be uniform and that they would be widespread throughout the ancient world. Okay, this is striking. Now, David Turner, picking up from Hangel, says the Gospel of Matthew is technically anonymous, as are the other Gospels. Again, he's referring to the narrative. Hangel's plausible argument that the titles of the Gospels are very early, perhaps even original with each Gospel, has positive implications for traditional views of the Gospel's authorship. The nearly unanimous attribution of the Gospels to their traditional authors by about 150 CE better supports the theory that their titles were original rather than the theory that they originally circulated anonymously. Now, here he's actually dipping into that second area that I'm eventually going to cover subsequently in this series. He's saying that the nearly unanimous attribution of the Gospels to their traditional authors by about 150 CE. Here he's talking about the witnesses to this among patristic writers. He's saying the fact that patristic writers were unanimous. When he says nearly unanimous, he doesn't mean that there's anybody that says something different. What he's saying is that there are some people who simply don't mention who the authors were, but everybody who does mention who the authors were identify these four people: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He's saying that's found already across the Christian world in patristic writings in the middle of the 2nd century. And he says this is consistent with the claim of Hengel that the evidence of the superscriptions being as uniform as it is and so forth, that these were all original and not merely early, right? Much less that they were, it points against, much less that they were added much later. All right. Carson, Moo, and Morris again say, until recently, most scholars tacitly assumed that the four Gospels first circulated anonymously and that the present titles were first attached to them about AD 125. Now, notice even this is significant, right? Even if it were the case that these titles were not given to them until AD 125, it shows that already that early the belief was that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote them, that this was universal, widespread, and uniform, such that they're putting these titles on the Gospels. But Carson, Moo, and Morris are actually pushing against this. They're saying until recently, that's what most scholars assumed to be the case. It says now, however, this consensus has been vigorously challenged by Martin Hengel. Hengel examines the practice of book distribution in the ancient world, where titles were necessary to identify a work to which any reference was made. In this context, he studies the manner in which 2nd century authors refer to the Gospels, calling to mind, among other things, Tertullian's criticism of Marcion for publishing his own Gospel, a highly truncated version of Luke without the author's name. Okay, so before I continue with this quote, let me just explain who Marcion is. Marcion was a 2nd century heretic who didn't accept the church's beliefs about God and Christ and so forth. And yet he wanted to maintain that he was a Christian. And so part of his project in proving his own views was creating a truncated canon. So he excised from the canon books like Matthew, Mark, John, and so forth, except for Luke and the writings of Paul. But even Luke and Paul had to undergo, a scissors and paste job, because Luke and Paul, of course, make copious reference to things that agree with the other Gospels that Marcion had excised, and so he had to do the same thing with those writings. But once he did that, he knew that he couldn't simply say that this was written by Luke, because the evidence of Luke was on hand to everyone. And so instead, he just didn't put a name on his reworked version of Luke. So Tertullian, who was an early church father, he wrote against Marcion. He wrote 5 books against Marcion, and he criticizes Marcion on this score, that he has a book that he claims to be authoritative, but it doesn't have any name. It says, Tertullian contends that, quote, a work ought not to be recognized which holds not its head erect, which gives no promise of credibility from the fullness of its title and the just profession of its author. So what he's saying is that unlike the canonical Gospels, which do hold their head erect, right, that do at the outset indicate who their authors were. This is not the case with Marcion's truncated gospel, and Tertullian condemns it on this ground. That's one of his many reasons for repudiating it. Then Carson, Moo, and Morris go on. Hengel argues that as soon as 2 or more gospels were publicly read in any one church, a phenomenon that certainly occurred, he thinks, not later than AD 100, it would have been necessary to distinguish between them by some such device as a title. The unanimity of the attributions in the 2nd century cannot be explained by anything other than the assumption that the titles were part of the works from the beginning. It is inconceivable, he argues, that the gospel could circulate anonymously for up to 60 years and then in the 2nd century suddenly display unanimous attribution to certain authors. If they had originally been anonymous, then surely, pardon the typo again, there would have been some variation in the 2nd century attributions, as was the case with some of the 2nd century apocryphal gospels. Okay, here's David Turner again. He says, this gospel was ascribed to Matthew the Apostle by the 1st quarter of the 2nd century CE. And there he is, first of all, referring to patristic testimony, but he goes on to say, the titles of noticeable ancient manuscripts, and he lists some of them there in parentheses. That first letter is the Hebrew letter Aleph, referring to Sinaiticus. The second is B, referring to Vaticanus, and so on. Okay, he says the titles of notable ancient manuscripts ascribe the book to Matthew. Okay, now here I'm going to just show you a website real quick if I can. And I'm not too far from being finished with, this area so we can take some questions. But here is a website. Let me blow that up. That gives you some of the manuscripts that are in view when Hengel and Carson, Moo, Morris, Turner, and others refer to the superscriptions. Okay, these aren't all of them. This is just one source that I found that's accessible online. And actually, when you look at, if you look at Greek text critical editions of the New Testament that have a apparatus at the bottom where it shows what the different manuscript witnesses have at certain places. A lot of those textual apparatuses are very sparse when it comes to the superscriptions. They they include some of the references, but they're hardly exhaustive, right? And this website is no different. It's hardly exhaustive. But here it shows a number of manuscripts that have the title Euangelion kata Mattheon. Okay, so this right here, Euangelion kata Mattheon, means the gospel according to Matthew. Okay, here's another form of the title, Euangelion kata Mattheon. The difference here is simply one of how they spelt Matthew on this particular manuscript. Here is another manuscript. It says Euangelion Hagion kata Mattheon, which means the holy gospel according to Matthew. Okay, but for the most part, the earliest manuscripts simply say kata Mattheon or Euangelion kata Mattheon. Okay, so this is the sort of thing that Hengel and others have in mind when they talk about the superscriptions to the Gospels. Okay, there's the website if those who are viewing this want a reference to some of those manuscripts. Here is just this is one manuscript. This is P4. It's Papyrus 4, so it's written on papyrus. It says this title sheet was this is just one of those. I just picked one out of the hat. And this is a statement made in Comfort and Barrett's book, Complete Text of the Earliest New Testament Manuscripts. It says this title sheet was probably produced around AD 175 to 200 because that is when it became stylish for scribes to insert a hooked comma, an apostrophe between double consonants, as here between the thetas. Here, they're just making an observation about writing style and certain practices, and they're saying that the evidence on this manuscript demonstrates that it was written towards the end of the 2nd century. Okay, referring to the same manuscript, this is from Simon Gathercole. He says the best conclusion may be to assign a date of late 2nd, early 3rd century. Now, okay, so that's just an example. By the way, Simon Gathercole, I didn't quote him here much, but actually he has an article, and I was looking for it earlier today, and I couldn't find it.
You know what? I was actually reading that in preparation for the stream today, so I can share the link to that for anyone interested.
Oh, excellent. That's great.
You want me to stop sharing your screen?
Yeah. Go ahead and
Okay.
do that.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that presentation. That's very insightful and very informative. So I do encourage everybody to please go back once again. If you haven't been taking notes, please go back, listen again, take notes, take screenshots of the slides. I've been kind of looking through the chat to see if there's any questions. I haven't. Okay, we got one here. I want to really stay on our topic of Matthew, authorship of Matthew. I guess this is we can cover this if you're interested, brother. Was Matthew written in Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek originally? If you want to cover that.
Okay, so in the next episode, I plan to deal with this at greater length, because when you look at the external evidence, this is where you get the idea that Matthew could have been originally written in Hebrew, and that notion arises in Papias. Papias is a early Christian who was from Asia Minor, associated with the Apostle John, and his testimony to the authorship of the Gospels is significant. We don't have his actual statement from any writings of his that have come down to us, but we do have it quoted for us in Eusebius, who is the father of church history. So in the 4th century, Eusebius, in his ecclesiastical history, quotes Papias, who makes the comment that the 4 Gospels were written by the ones that we traditionally ascribe to them. But in connection with Matthew, he makes this statement that's variously understood and much disputed. He says that it was written originally in the Hebrew dialect, and then people interpreted it in various ways. Now, I'm not going to be as detailed here as I will be next time. So if you're especially interested in this, make sure to tune in then. But there's various possibilities as far as how we understand Papias' statement. But one thing I can tell you, first of all, is that when you look at Matthew's gospel, there's no evidence, and in fact, it goes against the evidence to think that it was actually translated from Hebrew. Okay, when one thing is translated from a language into another language, it bears the evidence of that. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't Semiticisms, that is, Hebrew idioms or ways of speaking, but that's the sort of thing that you can find in writings that were originally written in Greek. If it had originally been written in Hebrew, there are certain things that you would expect to come over into the Greek text that just isn't there. It's quite evident that it was written originally in Greek. And besides that, certain things in the gospel don't work if it was originally written in Hebrew. So there's no good reason to think, from looking at Matthew itself, that it's a translation of something that was originally in Hebrew. Now, how do we understand Papias' statement? Well, I'm not going to resolve this right now because it would take a lot of discussion. But one way that people have understood Papias' statement is to say that Matthew, when it says that he wrote in the Hebrew dialect, the peculiar way it's written is understood by some. Not necessarily saying this is my view, but they're saying that he wrote with a Semitic style. Right, that it and like I said, there are Semiticisms and things like that, Hebrew idioms that are found in it, as well as throughout the New Testament, really. And so that's how some people have taken the statement. Others have argued that Papias, that there was an an earlier proto-Matthew, if you will, that he circulated among Jews, but then eventually wrote in Greek. And Papias just wasn't aware of that that development, right? He just thought of the two in connection with each other because from the same author. A third way that people have understood this is they've said that while Papias knew, because he was associated with the Apostle John and so forth, who the authors of these Gospels were, it was also understood that there was this book out there that certain groups of people were referring to as written to the Hebrews. And Papias may have thought that that was Matthew's, that was the Gospel of Matthew that he had in Greek and had received within the church. And it was simply mistaken at that point. So there's various ways of understanding that, various possibilities. I'll get into what I think the evidence best supports next time. But the fact is, Papias is an early strong witness to Matthean authorship, and nobody contradicts his testimony at his time or elsewhere or later. Nor is there any discrepancy among the superscriptions on the manuscripts. And by the way, with respect to the manuscripts, I focused on the superscriptions, but a lot of those manuscripts not only have superscriptions, but subscriptions, and they also have running headers. And so it's not just that you have the names of the apostles written on these Gospels at the beginning. In many cases, you have their names written at the end and at various places along the way, at the top of the page, on each page, or running along the column or the side margin. So the names are all over the ancient manuscripts.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much, brother. Okay, we have another question up here. By the same criterion, the way we say Matthew is quote unquote anonymous, is the Quran anonymous too?
So I was actually thinking of bringing up something along these lines. Yeah, so when you look at various surahs, first of all, Muhammad's name only appears 4 times actually in the Arabic text, right? Right, Jai?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. So his name only appears 4 times, and I can't think in any of them where he's actually identified as the one who was the source of. Well, certainly there's no indication that he's the source of each of the surahs of the Quran. I mean, how could you even get that, right? Think, for example, of Surah 114. If there is a place in the Quran that mentions Muhammad's name and it calls him a messenger and speaks of him conveying Allah's words, how does that necessarily identify Surah 114 as one of those things that he conveyed? Right? It doesn't. Right? It's just not the case. You're not going to get from the Quran the idea that Muhammad was the one who is the source through, or the means through whom this message is communicated. All these surahs, right? So you've got a huge problem there. If they want to point out the formal anonymity of the Gospels, you've got this huge problem of the almost complete anonymity of the entire Quran. Now they might claim, well, we can turn to the Hadiths, but notice that the Muslims, I mean, all the stuff that goes into Hadith criticism here, now becomes a factor, right? This would mean that Allah's word rests on the evidence that we have from the Hadith, and so it would only be as strong as the Hadiths, right? It would only be as strong as the evidence we have for accepting certain Hadiths, and that's a whole morass of a problem in itself.
All right. This is a little outside of the scope of your discussion today, but I'm sure you will be covering this in the internal evidence. This is a common one that you hear from Muslims, especially, that in Matthew 9:9, Matthew refers to a man called Matthew, and so the suggestion is that Matthew couldn't have been the author if he's referring to himself in third person. So, what do you say to that?
First of all, that's just plain bad, right? I mean, a person telling a story can refer to himself in the third person. That's found throughout the Bible, not just the Gospels. It's, even when we're talking about books that are not anonymous. Think, for example, of Paul, right? In his correspondence with the Corinthians, he refers to himself in the third person. He says, there's a man, right, in Christ, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, but he was caught up to the third heaven, right? Most people think he's referring to himself there. That's that's just a common feature whenever somebody's writing a narrative, right? There's no reason that Matthew couldn't have written about himself in the third person. Jesus frequently referred to himself in the third person in the Gospels, right? He says, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Is Jesus talking about some other person coming to give himself as a ransom for many? No, he's talking about himself. Now, obviously, Muslims don't think Jesus gave himself as a ransom, but that's irrelevant to what the Gospels are talking about, right? In the Gospels, Jesus is clearly saying that he was going to give himself as a ransom for many.
Yeah, and I know that the Quran is full of these as well, except I'm sure you have a bunch of funny ones where Allah talks about first person, second person, and in the same verse as well. So
Yeah, I mean, the first chapter of the Quran is, it doesn't begin with the word say, right? Which is normally Muslims claim that when it's preceded by the word say, this is Allah's speech, and he's telling Muhammad what to say, right? So everything in the Quran is Allah's speech, right? According to Muslims. Well, when you go to Surah 1, it doesn't have the word say, and it's just Allah speaking, and it's not indicated that this is Allah telling Muhammad what to say, even though everything in the Quran is supposed to be what Allah says, but then there are special statements that Allah tells Muhammad to say, right, that makes this distinction. The first chapter of the Quran doesn't have that, and it's spoken in the third person about Allah, right? So Allah's talking about himself in the third person.
right.
And he banters back and forth in a quite inconsistent manner. Muslims pretend this is part of its literary excellence, but you often can't follow who's talking about who. And so Allah will switch from speaking about himself in the first person to speaking about himself in the second person to speaking about himself in the third person, and also switches back and forth between speaking in the singular and the plural. So,
Right.
if that's an evidence against Matthean authorship, then all the more it's evidence against authorship of the Quran. I mean,
I have a thank you for that answer, brother. I have a funny example here, chapter 6, verse 114. So I guess the idea here is just to follow the pronouns and try to keep up and see if you're not confused by the end. So, shall I seek a judge other than Allah when he is the one who sent down to you the scripture, explained in detail, and those to whom we gave the scriptures know that it is the truth bestowed from on high by your Lord. So never be of those who doubt. So you can see how the confusion comes in here when shall I seek a judge other than Allah? Well, who's the speaker there? And then it goes on to say that we gave the scripture, so it's switching again between these different ways of speaking, first, second, third person, and yeah, it creates as you said, brother, it creates a big problem. Oh, sorry, I didn't see how the screen was here. If you guys, I don't know if you guys can see that okay or not. But yeah, so thanks for that, brother. We have another question here. Let me stop sharing my screen. Okay, so so this is not exactly formatted. I'll try to interpret it here, but I guess the question is, I guess maybe more of a preliminary question. It would be like, what is the gospel? And so maybe if you want to tie into this question here, he's saying how knowing what Matthew wrote matters if you don't agree that he has the right gospel. John is claiming, and so are Mark and Luke. So which of the four is the gospel of Jesus?
Okay, so notice first of all the assumption, because the Quran refers to the gospel of Jesus, the assumption here is that there was only one written account, right? And this is mistaken. You don't begin with the Quran and take it as the point of reference, right? And then look back across history and say, it's the Quran that's the criteria. I understand that Muslims believe the Quran is Allah's word and so forth, but if we're talking about why we should believe the Bible or why we should believe the Quran, that's not the rational way of proceeding, right? You don't begin with your assumption at the outset. And so from a historical perspective, we look at the history and then we see what lines up with the history, and the Quran just doesn't. If the Quran is claiming that there was only one written account, then the Quran is wrong, right? It is historically wrong. But here's the interesting thing. What I was talking about actually provides the answer to this. One of the things that Hengel brings out, as do numerous other scholars, is that the superscriptions on the Gospels are peculiar. What they indicate is an understanding, the way they're worded, katamatheon, katamarkon, and so forth, according to Matthew, according to Luke, is that the Gospels were viewed as forms of the one gospel, right? There's only one gospel that saves. The gospel is the good news about the coming of the king, right? And the ushering in of his saving kingdom. And the accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are simply the various forms in which that is conveyed to us, but they're all purveying the one gospel. And so the early church referred to the four as simply the gospel, right? That's why the manuscripts are written the way they are. It doesn't refer to the gospels as such. It refers to the gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Right? There are four writings, but these are the writings of the one gospel. And so they would refer to it as simply the gospel. For example, if you look at Ignatius, he simply refers to the gospel when he's referring not to one written account, but to several. You can look at Irenaeus's reference to the fourfold gospel, right? So even if we go with the idea that the Quran is right in referring to it in the singular, it's hardly a problem. Even though it's anachronistic, it's still not a problem, right? And actually, I think the Quranic author is simply reflecting the Christian practice of referring to the four accounts as the one gospel, right? So
All right, excellent. Yeah, we're just about over an hour, so we'll wrap up here. We really appreciate your time, and thanks everybody else for joining us. I was just wondering, brother, one more time, could you just recap this point? I thought this was a great point that you made, and Gathercole mentions a similar point in his article. The analogy to the book of Hebrews. You said it once, but I just wanted to, if you could just repeat it, because I think it's a very powerful point that the authorship of the Gospels is unchanging in terms of no one is like suggesting like a bunch of different authors for Matthew or a bunch of different authors for Mark, and then the analogy to Hebrews I think is really great. It's a really brilliant one. If you could just recap that one more time before we close out.
Well, yeah. So the book of Hebrews is unique in the New Testament in that it, unlike any of the others, is a sermon. Really, when you look at the last chapter, it's referred to by the author as an exhortation or sermon. And so you wouldn't expect somebody in a sermon to say, I, Anthony Rogers, or something like that. But it was known to the people who it was originally preached to and taken down by, but it wasn't considered necessary to preserve his name and so forth. But because of that, what happens is you have the book of Hebrews being associated with different people. Now, the most common person to associate it with is Paul, right? But there are different things that people observe that, some people think mean that it couldn't have been written by Paul. Differences in style and so forth. Some of these, there's arguments back and forth why this could be the case. For example, some differences in style could be accounted for by the fact that it's a sermon rather than an epistle, right? You don't preach the same way you write to somebody. And, but the fact is, because it was circulated anonymously after its original reception, different names came to be associated with it. People have said Paul wrote it. People have said Luke wrote it. People have said Apollos wrote it. And one of the things this shows that is that the early church wasn't just making up names to give something an appearance of authority that it didn't really have. They had grounds for accepting Hebrews, but when the epistle over time has been circulated without the name becomes disassociated with it, and people don't start thinking we need to add a name to it to give it some authority. Right? Nobody ever adds a name on the, you might have it collected with the Pauline epistles or something like that, but nobody's pretending that they know it to have been by Paul rather than that they think there's good evidence that it was written by Paul, right? There's a difference between the Gospels being circulated from the beginning as the writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, so that their names become attached to all these Gospels and throughout the world, and a book that people think there's reason to think is from Paul, right? And so you do find a proliferation of proposed authors for the book of Hebrews, but you don't find that in the case of the Gospels. So you can't just say that the early church is making up names when they don't do that in the case of Hebrews. And if they're making up names, why do they choose Mark as the author of the second gospel? Why not a more authoritative name? And why do they choose Matthew as the name of the first gospel? And by the way, I didn't mention this, but it's interesting. I mentioned that Marcion didn't accept the other books of the New Testament. He only accepted his own truncated version of Luke and writings of Paul. What's interesting is that Marcion doesn't deny that Matthew, Mark, and John were the authors of the other Gospels. He doesn't deny any of the traditional ascriptions of authorship. What he argues is simply that these guys were went astray, right? So he knows better than to try and argue that these weren't the authors. The evidence was too, abundant and well established. And so even heretics, heretics would be, or opponents of Christianity like Cerinthus or Julian the Apostate. These would be among the people that would most want to try and undermine, the Gospels or any of the books of the New Testament in order to, discount their credibility. And yet none of them say that these books were written by other people. They all accept the traditional ascriptions of authorship.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And I see some people were typing about the other, candidates for the authorship of Hebrews as well. David Allen has a book on that where he argues for Lucan authorship. It's really, I really like that analogy. I think it makes an amazing point in terms of the, universal acceptance and no one challenging the authorship and who the Gospels are credited to. So, well, we'll just wrap up here. And again, we just thank you so much, Brother Anthony, and thank you everybody else for being here and listening. And hopefully this was beneficial for all of the Christian brothers and sisters, and also for all of the non-Christians. Hopefully you guys will stick around for future episodes where we'll be kind of continuing this series, Lord willing, with Brother Anthony, maybe with Sister Hatun as the host. But yeah, we thank you all for coming. Thanks again, Brother Anthony, and we will close out here. God bless you all, and take care. Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you.